we're going to add a little wrinkle to the show, shall we say, break the frame. On Saturdays, we're going to add an extra shorter episode for a couple of reasons. We're going to keep the same premise of the interview shows, right? These property management specific people breaking the frame, ways to do things based on experiential learning. But on Saturdays, we're going to add a little bit more context. We're going to have these shorter episodes that you can enjoy in under 20 minutes that explain a little bit around the thesis around the show, these deeper concepts of the assumptions that we are taking and the reasons why we believe what we believe, a little bit of my backstory, some shorter concepts, other things that I can find, right? I just don't want to be constrained with the interview format every single Wednesday to add a little more value. And let's face it, most of my favorite podcasts, and if you're a podcast listener like me, have an extra shorter show on the weekends because really there's nothing cool being released on the weekends, and there's always like an extra 20 minutes that I want to learn something. So that's what this is going to be. And this first one is going to be an excerpt from the AI Summit that we did, Single Family Home Property Management 2030, SFHPM 2030, the future of property management and AI, where me and Jay Berube, who I co-hosted this thing with, explain the whole vision here of like where I see this disruption come from. It's going to have a lot of context that you've heard a little bits and pieces of on these prior episodes, but this is the whole concept of the innovator's dilemma, which is the downside, and category creation, which is the upside, and where I think it's going. For whatever that's worth, enjoy this episode. Look forward to other things like this on Saturdays. Oh, and one last thing. I'm going to call this series The Truth Around Property Management. All right, enjoy. Welcome to the Property Management Framebreakers podcast. I'm your host, Pablo Gonzalez, and I am here to introduce you to the folks in the property management space that have broken the frame of what you may believe was possible. This podcast is presented by Vendoroo. It is your all-in-one AI solution for resolving your maintenance needs. Let's go. I have not been running a property management operation. I have not been like a service provider or anything like that for property management, but I have been deep in the guts of JWB Real Estate Capital as kind of like the head of their content and interviewing real estate investors and stuff like that, and been obsessed with community building. And one of the things that I've noticed, as I'm also just like a business nerd, right? So one of the things that's very, very clear to me is that we're going through these three massive context shifts right now. In 2020, Wall Street rushed into the property management space. You know, the affordability crisis is happening at the same time. Call it causation, call it correlation. But we've gone from this world where property managers kind of got to live under the radar to a world where everybody has an opinion on it and the president is making executive orders about it, right? So perceptions from the outside have changed for the industry. Another massive change you're all very, very aware of as well is the great generational wealth transfer just getting started, right? We're going from serving boomers and their portfolios to serving millennials and, you know, their needs and wants and proclivities, right? And the way that they like to be served, right? So the clientele is changing. And now we're really just starting to hit full stride in probably what's going to be one of the biggest context changes in the world, which is this like industrial revolution around AI and everything that's happening. Well, what AI is doing is it's changing the tooling, right? It's changing the ability to how you're able to serve your clients. And everybody's got a million opinion on it, but you know, at the end of the day, nobody really knows what's going to happen. That's why to me, the best thing is, and I've had a lot of success in my life taking different contexts just because I'm a connector and whatever, what I hear in one space and bringing it into another space and giving suggestions in that regard, there's a lot to gain. So if we can really look around at other industries that have gone through these kinds of context changes and see what happens there and compare the commonalities and contextualize it to the property management industry, now we can put this like lens that really, really helps. And really the two lenses that I want to bring to this conversation is one that has to do with downside. And that's this famous book called The Innovator's Dilemma by Clayton Christensen. We'll talk about that in a second. And then the upside, right? Which is called category creation and category explosions, which was coined by this book called Play Bigger. And then just kind of talk about the things that will inevitably happen. There's kind of three things that will inevitably happen when this type of stuff happens. So that's the plan, man. It just became very obvious to me the moment that I got involved in all this stuff that this stuff's coming down the pike, and having these conversations to just kind of like pull our head out and look around. Sometimes when you're on this like log rolling competition, it's hard to look around and see the lake and see if there's a gator coming. But I think it's time.
Yeah, you shared with me the innovator's dilemma when we first spoke. You you get real deep real fast, but that's why I like you because I do the same. But you're talking about Blockbuster, Netflix, and you know, can you share a little bit about, that and then maybe even what the real threat is for property managers? I mean, we were talking about complacency,
Yeah,
adaptation,
yeah,
Kodak.
yeah. That's kind of it, right? Like we've all lived through this. Innovator's Dilemma, seminal business book by Clayton Christensen. You don't have to read it, right? Like the at the end of the day, what they studied kind of like why Sears was like one of the top companies in the world and now doesn't exist, right? That stuff has happened over and over again in our lifetime. Think about Toys R Us, think about Blockbuster, these kinds of things. And the weird thing about these, that it really coins the term innovative disruption, right? Like there's some stuff that disrupts stuff. There's no disruptive innovation, right? Like there's innovation, right? And then there's disruptive innovation, the type of innovation that's going to really change the paradigm and disrupt things. And what they found is, if you think about it, normally the incumbent, right, the biggest company, when they see something coming down the pike, they should be the ones with all the money and all the resources and all the power and all the wherewithal to like adopt this thing and lead it, right? But what we consistently see over and over again is that the incumbent doesn't do that. It's always an up and comer that ends up like toppling them, right? And what they have found, and I'll tell kind of the story of Blockbuster and Netflix because I think it's really germane here. But what they find is there's a couple of reasons why, but the reason why this happens is because the incumbent has so much like momentum in one way, right? Like it has so much gravity pulling it towards its existing business model, its existing kind of like technologies, its existing ways of doing things, its existing culture, its existing KPIs. It's like impossible to, that they might put their toe in the water, but then they quickly coil back. And the perfect example is Blockbuster versus Netflix, right? Like I think everybody knows, or most people know, that Blockbuster had the chance to buy Netflix for like $1 million, and that probably would have worked out pretty nicely for them. They didn't. But what they don't know is that Blockbuster first realized, okay, hey, expectations are changing. Netflix first realized we can change the expectation if we can get people away from thinking that they have to pay late fees, right? If we can just move them to a subscription model and give them as many DVDs by mail as they want, now we can change the industry expectations. Blockbuster saw it. They're like, we can do DVDs by mail, bro, no big deal. All right. And they didn't buy Netflix. They were just like, we're just gonna do it better than you. They started, and here's the aha. At some point, their DVD by mail service did so well that it started diminishing the dollar per square foot of their retail spaces. And at that point, they sounded the alarms and they said, pull this out, right? Because we are driven by this thing. And you know the rest of the story, right? Like Netflix has become one of the seminal companies of all time, and Blockbuster no longer exists, something that was ubiquitous in society. And if you contextualize that to the world of the property manager, right? Like that's why I bring up this idea of KPIs, right? Like it's not just who's doing the technological adoption when the expectations change. It's this idea of like, okay, well, if all of a sudden millennials want to be treated completely different than boomers, are we still going to, be beholden to like our old procedures? Are we still going to be beholden to the old technology that we used to use, right? Like what is, are we going to shy away from like cost of switching on a program when we really need it to, you know, create this next new thing, or are we going to go buy the next new thing and go through the pain of the old program? So that's the innovator's dilemma there, Jay. It's this idea that you're going to be pulled back into like the old ways if you are the incumbent because you have more to lose, and that means that if I'm an up and comer, I'm chomping at the bit, right? But if I'm an incumbent, and this is what I told JWB like a year ago, was I would go back to the drawing board and think, hey, what's going to stop me from switching, right? Like, what's going to stop me from making a move once I see an insight? Is it going to be a software that won't let me go? Is it going to be Gary in like back in accounting saying, "Oh, hey, this number now is not looking like it used to look, and now we got to switch back to the old way," or is it just going to be a culture, right? Like, is it going to be like a culture thing? And you got to be able to like push through that, or you're at risk.
Yeah, we were talking about the David and Goliath example and the opportunity for property management companies right now. What used to be our biggest disadvantage as smaller companies is our largest advantage now as property management companies. Being a smaller company means that you can be nimble and you can implement AI. And why now? Well, it's more important than ever. We were talking about with my business partner Matthew and I the Industrial Revolution and how long the Industrial Revolution spanned for. What, like 100 years? I mean, the Industrial Revolution changed the way we think about labor, business, the way that we live life. Well, to put this in perspective, the AI revolution is going to be, I don't know how many more X significant than that, but I can tell you it's going to be in a significantly less amount of time. I mean, in the next year or two there's going to be significant changes, but again, massive opportunity for property management companies to not just be seen as rent collectors, but to be seen as strategic advisors. There's this what I call the war on profit in property management. We're pressured with the amount, with our labor expense, we're pressured with software expense, and there's pressure with regulation and how much fees we charge. So it's even more difficult to be profitable. In order to be profitable, we have to be efficient. And in order to be efficient, we have to implement AI.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And I think the big takeaway here is you got to reduce your fear, your like cost of switch. You either have to be like brave and go against cost of switching, or look at cost of switching to stuff as like a real vulnerability. So, full disclosure, it's one of the reasons why I asked Randall to do the panel today, right? Like I think this idea of a property management system that has an open philosophy is something we need everybody to adopt, right? And that's kind of what that is Rentfine's POV, right? And when I talk about POV, it reminds me of the upside of what's here to be had, right? So innovator's dilemma is the thing that everybody's got to be aware of as your risk. What's the carrot here, right? Like that is the law of category. And essentially, this idea of category design and category creation was made famous by a book called Play Bigger that I do recommend everybody reads because I'm obsessed with it. I've been obsessed with it nonstop. It'll change the way you think and you market and you go to market and you think about business. But these people study this idea of like what happens when companies show up to be completely different, right? To be completely different, to create this like different future that's different from the past. And what they realize is that when this is done well, the company that does it well captures 76% of the market share, right? So just think about if you're the one that invents this new, hey, layer in this like new expectation, new customer, and new tooling, and you can capture 76% of your market, that's pretty sweet, right? So like that means you dominate, you become a category king. And the formula for that to happen is the category formula is a context change creates a new missing, right? So like when things change, all of a sudden there's either a new problem that exists or there's a new solution to an old problem that everybody thought was cost of doing business. And that missing, that's what creates the need for this innovation. So the bigger the context shift, the bigger the missing, the bigger chance that this disruptive innovation is going to completely change the game. And that's why I continue to talk about context shifts and these like massive context shifts that we're going through. But here's the plus side, right? Like somebody's going to capture 76% of the market economics, but the other law of categories that new categories create other categories. So let's look at it through another example. Amazon versus Toys R Us and Sears, right? Amazon clearly realized there was a context shift. You can now buy stuff online. They've changed the expectation. You expect to have everything home in 2 days, and that took Sears and Toys R Us to extinction, and they dominate that space, right? There's very little breathing room there. But guess what else there is? There is a whole bunch of rise of millions of one-person $1 million e-commerce businesses, right? So I say that to say that there's going to be kind of like two prizes here. There's going to be the category king, and then the other person that reinvents a business that's kind of completely different, right? So think of the idea that you and I 10 years ago could have never been a hotelier in your own city, and now you can because of Airbnb, right? So what happens when these categories get created? Somebody captures 76% of like the old category because they think of it the right way, and then a whole bunch of other options appear. While the original market valuation of that entire category goes down, the actual market cap of the whole category goes up, and there's plenty of other models that go and make money in a completely different way. So that to me is like the upside here, right? So as like property management is changing, somebody's going to be like the traditional property manager in your market that's going to dominate because they figure this thing out. But then there's nothing that doesn't say that you can't figure out a different way to do property management, that you become the one that captures that piece and that piece and that piece, and it becomes a much more profitable business. That's the upside to this.
Yeah, and the good news is that in today's summit, we're going to be talking about the tools so you can be in the right side of that shift. Pablo, in that book, was it Pattern Breakers? Is that the
Pattern
one?
breakers pattern
Pattern
breakers is the
Breakers?
best update to Play Bigger that there's been since Play Bigger in 2007. Yeah.
Yeah, you got me reading Pattern Breakers, and it's this series of events that all happen around the same time to make this seismic shift. So, for example, in property management, well, tenant communication is shifting from where we used to call tenants and they used to really want to have those conversations to now they want instant communication. People have less attention spans. They want quick answers. So we have to be prepared to provide them with that. We can't be doing business like we used to do business 10, 20, or even 5 years ago. But again, good news is we're going to be giving you the tools and you're going to hear from the right people to navigate you through that. So we're going to hear from Lindsay in a couple minutes from Super, but first we want to put up the first
Jay, can I
poll.
just kind of land like a vision of how I've thought
Land
through
it.
it in like 2 minutes, right? So
Do it.
the way, as again, I don't know what's going to happen, but I've studied this for a long time. This is my thesis, right? I look at the tooling and I look at the business models and I look at what's happening, and it's pretty clear that in the 2000s, kind of like do everything platforms got adopted by property managers, right? Like that's like the single family home property management solutions 1.0. In the 2010s, these like property manager specific softwares and toolings came out. That really has changed the game for you, right? Like you've really been able to like adapt that, make a much better business. That's what I call 2.0. Now it's the 3.0. It's the AI native tooling that's going to completely like change the way that you can think. It's going to break the mold of what you think. And to me, how you get there is number one, really get used to fighting the fear of cost of switching, right? And build as much of an infrastructure you can around something that isn't telling you when something changes, you got to wait for me to change it for you, versus when something changes, you're going to be able to change it for yourself and you're going to be able to experiment with that stuff, right? Right size the KPIs, right? So like, don't be afraid to, break off from the traditional thing that you measure yourself off of and go after the new thing that you think you should measure yourself off of. Don't be afraid to, or like, and don't rest on your laurels, right? Like Brad Johnson and his team came out with really good standards, right? But like, don't rest on your laurels if you're already above the standard, right? Like, know that there's going to be another level in there, right? And then last but not least, you gotta start looking at these 2.0 tools that you have and seeing, and 2.0 processes that you have, seeing where you can inject generative AI to help you make it more efficient, right? Get quicker at stuff, and then experiment with what's called agentic AIs, right? Like the AIs that completely own the problem for you and take it away, and be clear that generative AI is just kind of like a better way of doing things. Agentic AI is this thing can do it like I can do it and I can go do something else. And you got to kind of be able to experiment through that with an open architecture and, like not being complacent with your KPIs. That's it. I'm done. My best ideas.
Yeah. I look at that, Pablo. Generative AI is having a co-pilot that can do stuff with you, make you more efficient. And then that agentic AI, and you might not, attendees, you guys might not be familiar with these terms, or agentic AI, meaning coming in and doing that job for you, or at least a large majority of it.